Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Pat Downs. I'm with the Institute of Management Consultants and Advisors. I'm joined this morning by Peter Brennan, and Peter is known to many people in terms of the specialist skill set that he brings in terms of bid services. Dr. Brennan is a good friend to the Institute and indeed has helped us on many occasions in terms of sharing knowledge in this really important piece of the procurement jigsaw, if not the important piece in terms of moving forward. The whole kind of agenda in green public procurement is beginning to kind of, I suppose, pick up pace at a rate of knots. We were just discussing earlier, Peter and I, in terms of the size of the prize and really in terms of awareness from the receiving end. There's a huge piece of education to be done. We would say we're kind of in the foothills of the Himalayas in terms of where we're going. But we're very fortunate this morning, and indeed it's timely that Peter is with us because there has been some evolutionary steps over the period since last we spoke, Peter. And I'm particularly pleased that you're sharing those insights with us. I know Peter has been doing some significant work in terms of the actual public service side. And again, I suspect that this particular area is going to get a lot of focus and attention over the coming period. Equally, just to remind folks, and I know Peter will be touching on it later during the course of the conversation,
Yes,
or his
yeah.
presentation rather, that the OGP themselves are reviewing some of their, I suppose, platforms in terms of management consultancy in that area. And that pillar is coming up for review, I think, later this year and next year. They had a call out there over the last while. Some of you may have engaged with that, and I hope you did. It's very important. I know the last time we did a lot of work with them, and they're very keen that the SME sector get a visibility and get a piece of the pie. We would often say that if you're not at the table, you can become part of the menu. So it's important to engage in these processes and have your say and your spoke. And I hope some of you did. Now, equally conscious of time this morning, and I know it's not me that you're here to see, even though one would wish otherwise, that it's the wisdom that Peter brings that you want to hear. And I happily hand over the baton to Peter and no better man. And Peter Gurmil Mahagat for sharing the knowledge. And
Well,
perhaps we can have a few questions at the end, if that's okay, if that suits you.
yeah. Thank you very much, Pat. I'm very happy to have questions during the presentation as well, I might add.
Super.
Good morning. You're all very welcome. The topic is green public procurement. And while Pat said I have a lot of background in procurement and tendering and have had for about 20 years, I've also got what I call a reasonable background in as a specialist subject matter expert. This is a green procurement, or the climate change, is something that's near and dear to my heart. I chaired the Institute of European Affairs group on climate change. I've advised the Oireachtas on climate change. I've lectured on a master's program. I've been a director of the SCAI board for 5 years. I've written on it. I produced a book on investment in the area of climate change. So I'm quite interested in this topic. And now we're looking at it from the perspective of procurement. And this is a new and a complicated agenda. So in the next hour or so, I'm hoping to explain the basics to you, and hopefully at the very end show you, if you are tendering, how you can score more marks in this area. There's EU guidance, there's national guidance, there's a lot of information about. I'm going to focus primarily on the services sector. I'm not going to cover works because most of you on the call won't be involved in that space. And as I said at the very end, really going to address what's critical. Every tender, or most tenders now, will have to have a GPP criteria, and we'll discuss how you might actually score the most marks. And at any stage throughout the presentation, I'm very happy to take questions. Obviously, we'll take them at the end. So what are we really talking about? It's a process whereby the public sector are procuring supplies, services, and works with a reduced environmental impact. That's a very important word. In other words, they're reduced emissions, improved energy efficiency, or resource use efficiency. It's not just about carbon, it's about energy and the circular economy throughout the life cycle of the product. So you really, in your bids, are going to have to demonstrate that what you're doing ticks this particular box. You hear talk of sustainable procurement or social considerations. That's a much, much wider concept, and it's out of scope as far as today is concerned. Many tenders will look for information on social considerations, which is part of the broader sustainability piece. But as far as today is concerned, and as far as the government's strategy recently published is concerned, social considerations is for another day. Where do we start? Well, the Programme for Government decided or announced, and I quote, "We will mandate the inclusion of green criteria in all procurements using public funds within 3 years." And that's exactly what has happened. Last April, the government produced a new strategy called the GPP Strategy and Action Plan. The Department of Environment, Climate and Communications issued the document, and as it happened, I was an advisor to the department in the early stages of that particular process. So this is a political commitment embedded in the Programme for Government, and if it's in the Programme for Government, obviously something had to be done. The backdrop is a policy backdrop and a legal backdrop. We have a climate action plan. Ireland, in common with other member states, have legally binding emissions reduction targets set under different carbon budgets. We've energy efficiency targets. We have circular economy targets. And most serious of all are the emissions reduction targets. So we do not meet as a country our emission reduction targets by 2030, we will be fined. Some people speculate between 8 and 10 billion. So one of the reasons why green public procurement is being brought in is to ensure that when the government buys services, goods, or commissions works in the next period, next 5 years, it does so in the most sustainable manner. And that's why you're going to see a big change in the way tenders are worded in the next couple of years. It's to contribute in a very practical way to help the government achieve these targets. Just to reference the circular economy strategy, a lot of people don't know about it. This is a very new dimension to procurement. There is a draft strategy, and if you're advising any sector involving food, waste, packaging, construction, plastics, textiles, it's center stage of this strategy. So achieving the targets set in this strategy is one of the objectives of the new Green Public Procurement Strategy. Now, that being said, this is in draft only. There is a revised strategy due. I don't expect we'll see it this side of a general election, but there is a revised strategy due. If you do nothing else after this call, read the Green Public Procurement Strategy and Action Plan. It's available on the DEC website because it is the root source document for all the changes I'm going to talk about. It was published on the 4th of April, and it said that with immediate effect, all public tenders over the EU threshold must use green public procurement. And from the 1st of January next, all tenders over 50,000 euros and 200,000 for works must use green public procurement. Now, this is being communicated to the public sector, but a lot of people in the public sector aren't fully aware of this. I trained nearly 200 public servants last week from over 50 contracting authorities, and it was news to most of them. So the public sector is only catching up and becoming aware of these requirements. So GPP, Green Public Procurement, will become embedded in corporate procurement plans, and slowly but surely it will be included in the contracting authorities' policies. Now, there are 3,000 public bodies tendering at the moment, so it is not going to happen immediately. This is a slow, steady policy initiative. There are lots of actions and decisions in this document. They basically come from climate action mandates agreed across the public sector. There are minimum environmental criteria, which I'm going to cover. There's far more monitoring and reporting, which I'll mention. So in your tenders, you need to be aware that a lot of the public bodies need to report on greenhouse gas emissions or energy efficiency. So they would be asking you for data that enables them to do the reporting. As I said, it also applies to the circular economy. Interestingly, and this is very unusual, this document also applies to the commercial semi-states. The core rule is comply or justify. In other words, if you don't use green public procurement, you have to explain to your accounting officer in an annual report why you didn't use green public procurement. So that's quite a burden on all public authorities, and that's not just confined to government departments, as is the case at the moment. It'll apply to all contracting authorities. There's a very interesting section, a legal section, which I had draft in the document, explaining that if green public procurement is to be used, it must be contract specific. What this means in practice is that you, as a public body, cannot ask a potential tenderer for their general sustainability strategy or their corporate social responsibility strategy. It has to relate to the tender. It has to be verifiable, it has to be justifiable, and it has to be proportionate. So if you're bidding for a 60,000 euros consultancy contract, you're not going to have ISO requirements imposed upon you. That would be completely and utterly disproportionate. So if you believe the requirements are disproportionate or they're not contract specific, you should ask a clarification question as to why the public body is shaping the green public procurement criteria in a manner that's not correct. We all know, and I know this because I train a lot of tenderers, that Irish companies, and the vast majority of Irish companies, cannot currently meet the proposed environmental standards. At European Union level, green public procurement as a voluntary arrangement has been commonplace for 15 years, and it's only the last 2 to 3 years that it's come into Ireland. So we have a long road to catch up on. So it's relatively new. I mentioned that the programme for government stated that the introduction of green public procurement should be mandatory. Mandatory, to my mind, means primary legislation, and there isn't any, or in very strong guidance to accounting officers, and that hasn't been published yet. So at the moment, the strategy is more persuasive than mandatory, but it still will apply from the 1st of January to all consultancy contracts over 50,000 euros. As I said, there's going to be guidance published later on, maybe next year, on the broader sustainability issues and on social considerations. And this strategy does not apply to contracts below 50,000. So if you see GPP in a contract or a tender below 50, you should query the contracting authority as to why they're doing this. And also, it doesn't apply where there's no guidance. And in many sectors or subsectors, guidance does not exist and is not planned. So where GPP applies is actually fairly narrowly defined, as I will explain. This is a slide I give to the public sector. Just share this with you because it demonstrates to the public sector what and how GPP applies. First of all, they have to do a needs assessment right at the beginning as to why green public procurement is needed. It's put into their business case, and all tenders over 50,000 euros are usually subject to a business case that has to be approved within the public sector body. So GPP criteria and the technical specifications feed into the business case. And then selection and award criteria are determined. The tender is published. Typically between 5 and 10% of the marks will be allocated to green public procurement criteria. There's a contract awarded, and during the contract, and this is new, you will be asked to report on how the targets that you've set for emissions reductions, energy efficiency, or circular economy waste have been met. So you can expect a much higher demand in terms of reporting, far more so than is the case at the moment. So this circular economy, this circular procurement cycle is very much the way to explain GPP. It applies throughout all phases of a procurement. The The strategy itself is a very comprehensive document, but there are things missing. I think it's very important before I go into the rest of the presentation to explain. There's no enabling legislation. Under the procurement directives, green public procurement is voluntary, not mandatory. The government used the term mandatory, but mandatory obviously has implications. Now, for reporting requirements, you need legislation, primary legislation, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. Certainly it's not going to happen this side of a general election. Deeper circulars instruct accounting officers what to do, and they're taken very seriously because accounting officers are personally responsible for spending exchequer funds. Currently, there's only one circular, 2019, on green public procurement. It's due to be replaced. It hasn't been replaced. So until it is replaced, a lot of contracting bodies are waiting to hear what they exactly have to do because there's a degree of discretion in the strategy paper about whether they need to apply absolutely everything. And this particular circular will determine what aspects of the GPP strategy will have to be applied across the public sector. The Office of Government Procurement is also expected to change its standard tender documents and services contracts and goods contracts. It'll have to change its overall guidance to take account of GPP. It published guidance last October. A new section is now required on GPP. There's a revised circular economy promised. The construction works management framework, which is hugely impacted by this, we're not due to get new guidance until the end of next year. So it's going to be very difficult for works contracts to be published this for another 12 months or so, because the construction works management framework is almost silent on GPP. So there are specific guidance available, but not for all sectors. So there's quite a few gaps and a lot about to happen. So we're in a way in the foothills of the Himalayas or Carrantoul in relation to GPP. There's a lot going to happen in this space over the next 3 to 6 months. Excuse me. In the public sector, a lot is happening and has been happening. Most of the major public bodies have already published sustainability strategies. Now, if you're bidding into the CIE group, you want to be very mindful as to what their sustainability strategy is. Same with into the third level or HSE. Everyone in the public sector, most of the major bodies have published sustainability strategies. HSE, this is an example of Waterford City and County Council, they have strategies. So if you're bidding into them, your tender should be helping them meet their strategic objectives in relation to carbon. And if you can demonstrate that what you're doing helps them meet their objectives, their carbon objectives, you are on the way to scoring more marks. So in terms of developing sustainability strategies and indeed climate action mandates, which is something the local authorities are doing, a huge amount of work has been done in the last 12 months. But where the disconnect potentially is the green public procurement as a policy tool to help implement these strategies, that's what's missing. I mentioned there were several sector targets. Now, you're obviously, there's none for consultancy, you'd be glad to know. But if you're advising anyone in relation to the built environment or food or ICT equipment or textiles or printing, you should be aware that there are mandatory targets already. So if you're running a tender for ICT equipment, you have to comply with the EAT gold standard for products. Same with energy related equipment, indoor cleaning services, transport, etc. These are the targets, sector targets that were set in the GPP strategy of last April. They're the only targets that were set. Help is at hand. The Environmental Protection Agency have published a revised guidance on green public procurement. And this is a must read. If you're bidding, you have to read this document for two reasons. One, all significant tenders you'll be bidding for in the foreseeable future have to have green public procurement. And if you want to get a sense as to what's involved, this is where you go. It's incredibly well written. It is reflecting a lot of stakeholder feedback. It is constantly being updated and revised. It references 11 sector guides, which are separate, which the EPA have published, which in turn are also incredibly well written. And it also applies to semi-state companies. Most government rules on procurement don't apply to the commercial semi-states, but this particular guidance does. So these are the 10 priority sectors. If you're, again, it doesn't cover business consultancy, but if you're advising in any of these areas, and indeed furniture, which is another area just published in the last short while, you should be aware that there's extremely detailed guidance available. For road transport, IT products, food and catering, cleaning, office buildings, lighting, heating, energy-related products, paper and textiles. So these are the sectors that are the priority for government in terms of green public procurement. Now, this is a busy slide, and sorry, this is a screenshot of what the government strategy states, or the EPA guidance states, in relation to consultancy services. That's all that there is, basically a page or half a page. Professional services account for 15% of total procurement, but we barely get a page. And here it explains to the public sector what you need to do if you're running a tender for professional services. Let's go to the section on award criteria. You must, according to the EPA, seek environmental impacts. So in other words, if you're delivering consultancy services, it would be reasonable for a public sector body to ask you, in delivering the services, how you're going to do so with the least environmental impact. And it's up to you to explain how that's to be done, either by training, by using sustainable products, by hybrid working, by using public transport, by not printing documents. They're the practical steps. So there's very little in terms of guidance available in terms of professional services. I remind you again, this must be contract specific. So if you get a tender for professionals for consultancy services, it has to be relevant to that contract. So they can't include generic requirements. Back to the bigger guidance. This is an extract from the guidance on heating. And I put this in because you can see there's very specific recommendations in relation to renewable energy, renewable electricity, microgeneration, energy performance contracts, power purchase agreements, retrofitting, which is a big area worth about 20 billion euros. So there's very specific guidance provided. So if you're a public sector body in this space, procuring in this space, these are the sort of guidance that you look to, the EPA guidance, and you therefore transfer the guidance into your tender documents. Same with food. There's huge detail available for anyone advising in the food and catering industry. And once you read these documents, as I do on a regular basis, they have the same look and feel. They have the same core sections, and they're very easy to navigate and very easy to access. This is just to illustrate what sort of level of detail the public sector is getting. And you need to be aware, if you're advising or getting involved in, say, food and catering, what the other side is thinking, because if you know what the public sector side is thinking, you as a private sector body can contribute. They look to what are called technical specifications. They give you a list here of TS1, TS2, the technical specifications. There's significant detail in further pages, which I won't go into today, explaining what, for example, the technical specification for food packaging would be. You'll also see here there are two categories: core criteria and comprehensive criteria. Comprehensive criteria is the honours course. It is very complicated. It needs detailed verification, and generally speaking, I haven't seen any public sector body use any of these comprehensive criteria because, for the reason I explained, they're far too complicated. Every single sector guidance would suggest award criteria and contract-specific clauses. So this is the same for the core 11 sectors. Now, there will be further sectors added, and the biggest single gap in this particular armory of GPP collateral is in the whole area of works procurement, which we'll talk about that another day. Another recommendation in the strategy is that life cycle costs should be embedded into the technical specifications and into pricing models. Now, I'm not aware of any more than a handful of people in Ireland who actually understand and can apply life cycle costs, and I'm not one of them. It's a very complicated area, and it's a particularly complicated area in works. And the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland have thankfully introduced a life cycle cost guidelines for the contractors involved in works contracts. If you have to do life cycle costing, help is at hand. The European Commission have a menu of life cycle cost tools, which you can see the hyperlink there. But there are literally dozens of potential life cycle cost tools available. So you need to experiment and find the one that best suits your requirements if you're asked to price using a life cycle cost formula. And I haven't seen one tender that required this in the last 6 months. Just to show you a few information sources that are very helpful in terms of discovering what the public sector is going to look for. This document, the OGP Framework DPS category, is available. If you Google it, you'll find it as it's buried in the back of the OGP website. It's a fantastic resource. It lists not only all the OGP frameworks and DPSs, but it lists the recommended green public procurement for every single category and subcategory, including business services. So it's worth having a look at this to see what the public sector is being encouraged to do for all the frameworks and DPSs that are currently in place. In addition, if you really want to get stuck into GPP and you have plenty of time on your hands, the European Union also has a wide variety of technical data and guidelines, which are in addition to what the EPA has. Now, this would only be very relevant if you were bidding for very large scale public contracts, and particularly in the area of works. These particular guidelines many of them do not apply in Ireland, but they can be reflected in public tenders, and it'd be best practice for you to reflect them in your responses. If you really want to get under the fingernails of what's going on in GPP, there's a public resource available from the European Commission. They have a 6-module GPP training toolkit, which I use parts of when I'm training the public sector, which goes into significant detail about the steps involved in the introduction of GPP best practice across the public sector. Very helpful training kit. I see there's a few questions coming in. Can you maybe check the questions while I continue?
Peter, sorry, those are the links to the documents that you're referencing in the courses. So just be helpful to people just when they're downloading them.
No problem, no problem. Is there any questions at this stage? Probably had a little interruption. Hope I'm not rabbiting on too much.
No, it's very interesting.
Okay. In any tender, you know, every tender has different parts. There are the technical specifications, which informs the selection criteria, which in turn informs the award criteria. So in relation to technical specifications, the Green Public Procurement Strategy gives public bodies a few options, including requesting an impact of the result of the effort you're doing to do a consultancy study. It may request your carbon footprint or how your carbon footprint applies to this particular contract. They may ask you for your proposals in relation to the specific contract as to what you intend to do in relation to training on sustainability. They may ask you to measure, report, and monitor greenhouse gas emission reductions, energy efficiency improvements, and resource efficiency measures under the circular economy. These are all the options they have. Some or none of these may appear in the documentation, but you can expect to see language like this starting to appear in government contracts. Typically, they'll also look for at least 2 relevant and comparable references where environmental and sustainable considerations were used in the delivery of contracts. You might find an additional cell added to the current template for reference sites. If you're looking for CVs, they may add an extra cell looking for the environmental expertise, experience, and qualification. Where it's relevant to the contract, you may find an additional layer of information requested when the public sector looks for CVs. It is possible you may be asked, if you're bidding for goods, that you may be asked to provide samples. You certainly will be asked for larger scale contracts to have ISO for energy management and indeed for environmental management. Very, very few Irish companies have these or equivalent standards, and that's a major shortcoming. For example, EMAS, I don't know how many companies in Ireland have it. It's not yet a mandatory selection criteria, but it could soon become one. It's expensive to get, it's expensive to maintain, but if you have IMAS, you're certainly on a competitive advantage compared to most Irish companies. So you would score higher marks if you have environmental management system processes, which are third-party certified. Now, whether this is over the top, it becomes an over-the-top requirement for low-value contracts remains to be seen. So if, for example, for €60,000 consultancy contract, they insist on ISO, the ISO for this particular, I think it's 24,001, you could ask a clarification question saying, is this proportionate to the requirements? Because having ISO is usually for large-scale, high-risk contracts. So having an ISO requirement for a below EU threshold contract, to my mind, would be disproportionate, and they should withdraw that request. The rule is from the 4th of April last that all public contracts over the EU threshold must include a award criteria of 5%. Now that can go as high as 10% and even higher if the emissions reduction potential of the tender is high. That rarely happens. So as I've seen to date, nearly all contracts above 50K are including a 5% threshold. Now 5% is, you may say, oh, that's not a lot. Well, let me put it in perspective. My business, we evaluate tenders every week of the year, and the vast, vast majority of tenders that we work on and advise on are won by the split of 1 or 2 percentage points. So if you get your green public procurement right, you get 5 marks out of 5, you are seriously helping yourself win a tender, given the fact that the scoring on tenders, particularly for business consultancy, is really, really tight. So doing your best to get those 100%, and it's not too difficult to get 100% in relation to GPP, should be your target after this call. Briefly back to the construction works management framework. And those of you who are advising companies with large capital expenditure, you're going to have to be familiar with how green public procurement will eventually apply to works contracts. This is what's on the government procurement website. There's really nothing in it other than the fact that for preliminary and definitive project briefs, there has to be a green public procurement dimension, and that life cycle costs apply to building contracts over a certain threshold. Very little else has been added. Nothing is promised until the end of next year, which is a shame because we're going into a very heavy period of government construction, and government construction is massively carbon intensive. So it's a lot to happen in this space in the next 6 to 12 months, particularly around the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which has just been agreed in a European Union level. So the Irish Green Building Council, which is a group comprising of the main contracting authorities, main contractors, should I say, are acutely aware of the importance of GPP in their sector. I could give a full lecture on works. In fact, I'm speaking to Engineers Ireland at the end of the month on the works implications of GPP. You need to be aware, if you're bidding, why you're being asked for data. There is a requirement across the public sector to generate data on emissions, energy efficiency, and resource efficiency. So that's the reason why you're going to be asked potentially for data. So you need to think in your own businesses, do we have this data? If we have, how can we collect it? How can we monitor it and present it? In the public sector, any public body that has a spend of over 200 million, and that's quite a number, a couple of hundred, are encouraged to get the gold standard for sustainable procurement, which is ISO 2400. To my knowledge, not one public body in Ireland has this standard. And over time, you probably will see the main commercial semi-states getting this standard. And then when that happens, they would introduce even more refined green public procurement requirements. I'd say this will happen progressively over the next 3 to 4 years. And having this gold standard will put you top of the class. And I'd imagine that the commercial semi-states and the public bodies that have the biggest carbon footprint will introduce this in the first instance. So let's get down to brass tacks. You get a tender in, 5% award criteria. How do you score maximum marks on a contract-specific basis? Well, the first thing you do is you tell the contracting authority you have a sustainability strategy. So get one. It might be an idea for the IMCA, just throwing this at you, Pat, to maybe workshop a formula or a standard that everyone in the organization can have that sets out the broad principles of sustainability, and then everyone can bespoke the broad strategy to their specific business requirements. So having a sustainability strategy and demonstrating that in your tender documents gets you to first base.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter. We'll take that on board.
Yeah. You also need to explain your environmental credentials. You have them. You probably haven't documented them before. You probably are applying without knowing, like hybrid working or working from home saves a lot of carbon. So the trick is to explain all of this. You don't go to clients' offices anymore. You do remote working. That's carbon saving. So you have a track record, document it. Really, really importantly, you're bidding into the CIE group. They have a sustainability strategy. Within that group, Bus Éireann has a sustainability strategy. And you need to show that if Bus Éireann have a tender, how your solution fits with their sustainability strategy. And the vast majority of public sector bodies in Ireland have either a sustainability strategy or, in the case of local authorities, what's called a climate action mandate. So if you're bidding into Waterford City and County Council, you need to read their climate action mandate to say, our tender fits with your mandate because we see that you've got the following ambitions and our solution fits with those ambitions and has the potential to do X and Y. The next thing you need to do is to get your carbon footprint. I'll explain how you can do that. So you indicate in the section on the bid, our carbon footprint is 42 kilos per ton, or 0.4 kilograms. And then you can say, right, we've 12 consultants, and we reckon that we will spend 40 days of one consultant on this contract. And that's the equivalent of 0.4 kilograms of carbon, which is an incredibly small amount, but you're able to quantify the carbon impact of your delivery on a contract. And usually the only thing that needs to be measured is the energy use of your computer, because everything else is more or less doesn't impact. If you can generate data, provide it. For smaller value contracts, that's not going to be possible. But if you're involved in a larger scale contract where there's energy efficiency improvements, for example, if you're involved in a contract involving retrofitting, you certainly be able to indicate and generate energy efficiency improvements data. So explain how in your proposed approach and methodology, how you're going to work from home. You're not printing documents. What's the carbon saving on that? You can identify that from your carbon footprint. You're not using public travel. You can identify the impact of that in your carbon footprint. And this will all help you deliver the contract in a low carbon manner. And that's all the public sector is seeking. That ticks the box. So when the 5% has been assessed, the evaluator will say, did this particular potential tenderer tick all our boxes? And the short answer is yes. Now, there's an a la carte menu. Not all of these apply in all cases, but for most tenders, you need to look at the key components on this particular slide deck. Help is at hand. The business in the community has a lot of documentation about sustainability and the low carbon pledge. So if you're not a member of business in the community, you can check their website to see what other companies across the country are doing in terms of embedding sustainability and putting sustainability at the center of their delivery. Such as PwC and the OCP group. There's plenty of examples about responsible purchasing policies, sustainability policies in the private sector. Now, obviously, it's scalable. If you're a small company, you don't need to have the same as a big multinational. But as I said at the outset, it's very important in tendering that you can say to the public sector, we have a sustainability strategy. It might only be 4 or 5 pages, but we have a sustainability strategy, or we have an IMCA accredited sustainability strategy, which would be even better. You should also sell your carbon footprint. You could say we have a carbon footprint that's 50% lower than our competitors. Can't go and tell you how to do that because there are competitors on the call, but it's very important to emphasize your carbon footprint and the carbon footprint as it applies to the delivery of this particular service. And most business consultancies are selling days of time. So 50 days working, it doesn't matter what grade, is usually 50 days at a computer. What is the actual carbon footprint of 50 days on a computer? If you have a carbon footprint, you can work that out very easily. So you go to the Department of Business. They have a free toolkit for helping any company determine their carbon footprint. You basically input your data and they generate your carbon footprint for you. So that's been in existence now for at least 2 years. So try out the Climate Toolkit for Business. There are also a significant number of Enterprise Ireland investment grants in relation to improving sustainability, including climate action vouchers, Green Start, Green Plus, and strategic consultancy. So if you're an EI client, you can talk to your EI contact to say, listen, we're now moving into the sustainability piece in terms of tendering. How can you help us? Obviously, EI clients have to be export oriented. So that is perhaps a restriction for some of you. But there's a lot of grants available to help companies progressively get into the sustainability space. Coming to the end, green public procurement is, without any doubt, an additional layer of complexity, but it is necessary. When in budget 2029, we all hear we're being fined 8 billion euros for not meeting our carbon targets, we're going to be shocked. Whereas if we impose green public procurement between now and then and make our purchases far more sustainable, the fine might drop to maybe 7 billion. So there's cause and effect. GPP will help public bodies also meet their climate action plan and circular economy strategies. So you need to be acutely aware if you're bidding into a public body, if they have a climate action plan or a climate action mandate or a sustainability strategy, how your proposal will help them meet their targets. At the moment, the strategy is persuasive, but in short order, I'd imagine DPER will issue guidance to accounting officers across the public sector. And once that happens, guidance is taken basically as a mandatory instruction to accounting officers. So while it's not promoted by primary legislation, the public sector will up a gear significantly once this DPER circular is published, and it's promised before the end of the year. As is today, investing in training and communications is essential, both in the private and public sector. This needs to be ramped up, otherwise these objectives are not going to be met. And at the end of the day, and at the end of this call, when you see the next tender, you see green public procurement 5%. Let's hope you score 5 out of 5, get 50 marks out of 50. And I hope what I was talking to you about this morning will help you to get to that particular target. Really what we're talking about is making sure that the goods, the services and works that the public sector procures achieves value for money over the life cycle that benefits not just that organization, but the environment and the national economy more generally. This is a completely different mission statement for procurement than has been in the case in the past. That concludes, and I hope you got a bit of value. And those of you who are interested in the background to investing in the green economy, the book I published a few years ago is there. I used that when I was lecturing in DCU. There are about 500 hyperlinks in the electronic version of that to every element of climate change. So there we go. Q&A, suitably chaired by Pat.
Peter, that was outstanding, and thank you. And we put some links in the chat section as well for people, just as we were following the cadence of the conversation. Outstanding as always, Peter. And I guess from our perspective, and we'll wait for some questions coming in, I mean, what struck me really is the general lack of awareness of this. I mean, I can remember going back about 7 years ago when the guidelines were kind of being disseminated out there, and they were talking about a 10% threshold at one point, although it never really kind of got any particular traction. So 5% is a really, I suppose the takeaway for me is that you were saying that it's won and lost in the margins of 1 and 2% in terms of the contracts. And I mean, if we take nothing else away, the importance of actually focusing on that incremental potential 5% and getting as much out of it for the simplicity of actually just putting that element of the equation into your response is extraordinarily fruitful and valuable for ourselves. And I know it doesn't come into the professional services at this point, but I mean, it will, I think, in due course. I mean, if we look at the CSRD, for example, and how that's been pushed down through kind of the layers in terms of the supply chain as well, and the impact that that's having in terms of people responding to that, because, you know, from a procurement perspective, buyers are actually pushing it down the pipeline. I've no doubt that this will be the other side of the coin. It'll be pushed down through our services as well in due course. So it would be foolhardy not to expect and accept that this is coming down the tracks from our particular perspective. And again, a lot of the cohort that we have on will be under that, you know, the tenders that they will be looking at generally will be under the EU kind of threshold at this point. But those thresholds incrementally are reducing as we go ahead as well. And I suspect over, you know, if we were sitting here, please God, in 5 or 10 years' time, we'd be having a slightly more cathartic conversation in terms of the rubber has hit the road, and we are very much in the space in terms of having to deliver that. And I suspect at that point, Peter, and you might have a view on it, that it's going to be more than 5%. It'll probably be, you know, 15 or 20% if we look at the way, you know, the way of the world at the moment.
Well, it's 5% because this strategy is a starting point. As you correctly said, foothills of the Himalayas. It's been going on in Europe for 15 years. We're playing catch up as we normally do, but it's going to accelerate. And I think once the government, the deeper circular is issued, it'll ramp up awareness across the public sector that this 5% or 10% is the stick that's going to be used by the public sector to get the private sector onto the sustainability agenda. But we shouldn't see it as a stick. I think most companies should be doing this anyway. Most companies are doing it anyway, but they're probably not articulating it in their tender responses. I think the point I made about having an IMCA sort of sustainability principles document, you don't need to go into the nitty gritty. We could draft up a sustainability principles that all members aspire to, and you could therefore badge that in your tender documents. So having effectively a standard that everyone can subscribe to should score everyone marks. Now, where's the competitive advantage? So you can get a few more marks, like covered. There's obviously contract-specific responses to different tenders. This is going to be a game changer in procurement. It's already a game changer. For all the public sector bodies that I train see it as a game changer. And I'm basically training practically every week this to the public sector this side of Christmas. And that tells you how important it is from the public sector perspective.
Yeah, I mean it's extraordinary. I think you see waves of issues coming at us, be it Brexit or be it coming out of the pandemic and the logistics issue at that time. You're looking at cyber and you're looking at all the big blocks that are inevitably coming across our radar. And this, I suspect, is going to be one of the next big ones that this time next year is going to be very much in the zeitgeist. If you look at AI, for example, at the moment, it's certainly everyone's talking about AI, and that's very much front of center in terms of people's minds. But I think procurement is going to come back into the frame very much with a bang on this one because this will impact everyone right across the food chain. The public services in terms of the scale of their procurement footprint. And again, if we know and have looked at the last budget in terms of the scale of that and what will flow from that over the next 12 to 24 months as well, that will probably lead to significant procurement opportunities. So from a competitive point of view, it would be foolhardy not to embrace this and actually have it as a compelling competitive advantage as part of your tender package.
Yeah.
And I suspect, Peter, and I know you gave us this guidance the last time, and we've taken it on board, and a lot of people have mentioned it, just as I know it sounds obvious, but sometimes the obvious isn't straightforward. But to actually, in your pack, your template pack of responses, which a lot of the folks have now done in terms of having that file, their tender file, and having their template responses. I think that solution in terms of the sustainability strategy for the entity is going to become very important, and it's going to have to be a living document that can be cut and amended and adjusted for the particular tender that you're going after. But that's going to, I suppose, require a little bit of thought in terms of just the next level of documentation that's going into that file.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'll give you a practical example. Next week, I've been asked by a very large county council to brief them on green procurement. They have a 112-page climate action strategy agreed and published.
I hope that wasn't hard copy now, Peter. I hope it was a digital version.
Digital version, of course. And they want me to go into their senior management team to say, looking at all their objectives, how their future tenders can be written to help them achieve their objectives and targets. Now, that's how seriously one major local authority has taken this particular initiative. Now, they haven't done much about it to date, but this is what's in the pipeline. And I suspect, and there's another local authority talking to me about doing something very similar. So the public sector is beginning to take sustainable procurement very seriously. We probably haven't seen the full manifestation of this yet. And when it comes to the end of the year, when the threshold drops to 50,000, I suspect there's going to be a little bit more visibility about this particular new initiative.
Yeah. And I mean, I know you mentioned earlier about the semi-states driving a bit of that. And I remember from a previous life, and we were doing some stuff with them recently, that they have embraced in terms of green procurement. I don't think it's as rigorous as what's coming and so on, but they certainly would be aware and over it. They've kind of started that journey, a lot of them, and would be aware of it. But I suspect it's going to be a body shock, Peter. I think for a lot of people, I think given everything that's going on in the world and the climate change is upon us. I still suspect this has become a body shock from both sides. From the you're busy until Christmas. I suspect you'll be busy until next Christmas on this.
Hopefully.
God, please God. Because I would sense there's a general sense of unawareness of the scope, scale, and size of this in terms of its impact from an administrative point of view, but also from a recipient in terms of providing tenders and responses to RFQs and RFTs and so forth.
I go back to the local authority example, this climate action mandate. I think the senior management team of that organisation were astonished when the mandate was concluded as to how sustainability permeates practically everything they do.
Yeah.
They're doing retrofitting, they're procuring IT equipment, they're procuring services. I mean, so their future tenders, all in a way, most of them have an impact on potential carbon emissions. And they want to get their heads around how it can be done. So it is going to have a dramatic impact. And the awareness level increased exponentially in this particular local authority when they saw the draft of their climate action mandate. And it's very specific. Their targets, it's a very operational series of action points. They now want to translate that into action. And the only way they can do it, as they see it, is through new tenders, procurement. So the penny has dropped big time, or the euro has dropped. Let's be a bit more colloquial.
And Peter, I mean, just going back to, I suppose, the SME cohort of the institute and so on, just from a practical advice point of view, what gets measured gets made. And my takeaway from this is measuring the activities that you're probably doing as an entity. And for example, can you, for example, put in the bike to work scheme if you were deploying that? Is that
Yes,
something? Could you?
absolutely,
Would,
absolutely.
okay.
That's a sustainability measure. Anything
Okay.
you're doing that is a sustainability measure helps convince the public body you're bidding into that you have sustainability on a post-it on your forehead. This is the way you operate, and that's the way you think. So that's
So
what I'm looking for.
other kind of, I'm just thinking, if, for example, entities are giving out or buying train tickets for employees and to reduce, which is, through the chambers and so on, that scheme where you buy reduced train tickets to give to employees to reduce their kind of transit time and stuff like that. I'm guessing that could fall within that category.
That I would call is that's explaining your sustainability category, which is the context in which you therefore submit a bid.
Okay.
What's far more important is that you have your carbon footprint. I know the carbon footprint of our business to the last kilo because we've had it independently assessed. And
Okay.
I know if I put 20 consultant days into a contract, I know exactly what the carbon footprint is. So I can tell all my clients if we do a piece of work for them what the carbon footprint implications are. And they're very, very, very low. And it's very easy to do a carbon footprint. So your strategy, which you're talking about bike schemes and everything else is great, but you need a metric. What is really
Okay.
convincing when you're bidding in is to say, this is going to cost 12 kilos of carbon.
So that climate toolkit for business would be very kind of helpful in regard to measuring that impact, I'm guessing.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not difficult to do. Go into the department's website. It's like filling out a Ryanair form. They'll ask you a whole lot of detail about their staffing, your buildings, your energy use. You complete the document and they obviously press a button and they give you a calculation as to what your carbon footprint is. It's a fantastic tool. It's not used a lot.
Wow.
And it's really helpful in bidding. So you yourself know what your carbon footprint is. And that's the sort of measurable that you're looking for.
Oh wow. I mean, and we put up a link to that in the chat. That's really helpful because I suspect, again, as you would well know, that a lot of the smaller to medium enterprises in terms of consultancy are very busy. It's that perennial kind of balance between client engagement and kind of, tenders are time consuming at the best of times, filling them out and kind of getting them correct and proper, and then looking for new business. So you have that trifecta of juggling going on between so anything that could help, and I think that could be really helpul.
Took me 15 minutes to fill out the form.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, I can tell
Okay.
you after this meeting, I will be beavering over there to get my. I would hope, Peter, that we'd be moving towards a carbon slipper as opposed to a carbon footprint. I can share with you, speaking against myself, in a previous life with a previous hat on, I was accused of having a carbon jackboot. Uh, I have found religion and come to the green side now, so I'm
You're
going to the
redeemed.
slipper. Yes, I'm looking for the slipper. All right, Peter, I'm very conscious of your time, and we said we'd have you out by 10:30. You have been most kind and very generous in terms of the information you've shared with us this morning, which is really potent. And we're going to record this and put this up to the members that weren't able to attend this morning. For any of you who want some really granular advice and insight in terms of the whole public procurement process or assistance in terms of delivering tenders or guidance in that area, Dr. Peter Brennan is available through the public procurement specialism that he has in terms of bid services. His contact details are there, and we'll make them available afterwards as well. Peter Akara Garmila Magat as always, and we look forward to engaging with you again. And in the meantime, go in good health and enjoy the rest of your morning. Thank you everyone for togging out. Keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page for the next modules that are coming up. And I release you back to the wild to have your coffee or your tea or your green tea or whatever. And have a great day. Thank you, one and all.
Bye now.